Today, I want to talk about the beginnings of the scientific revolution in a period of European history known as early modern Europe and the Renaissance. And I want to talk about the attitudes that were responsible for the scientific revolution and for a shift in ways of thinking that we as modern people take for granted. Now, what I have in this PowerPoint in the first slide in front of you is the basic chronology of the course. Not all of you may be familiar with the different time periods that we historians use for European history, so I just wanted to set the chronological framework for what I'm going to be discussing today and really for the rest of the course. So if we think about the scientific revolution, its origins come out of a period in European history known as the Middle Ages. Often referred to as the Dark Ages, about a century ago or so. And by the way, that term was a byproduct of later periods of time in European history when people believed that people back in the so-called Dark Ages, i.e. the Middle Ages, were ignorant and had no knowledge of the world around them. So that the later scientific revolution produced this idea that way back in the Dark Ages, people were ignorant and had not seen the light as we moderns had. So if we think about this course, we begin in the Middle Ages, which is divided into three distinct periods: the early Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, and all this followed on the heels of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And so people had thought that the pinnacle of civilization had been reached during the Roman Empire, and as a result, there was a decline in knowledge and of civilization. The Middle Ages, i.e. the Dark Ages, represented that decline. Early modern Europe is the period that follows the Middle Ages, and that is seen as a time by historians when people began recapturing the knowledge of ancient Greece and of Rome, that they began to understand the world around them much better, that they began to organize their political affairs and in general society in a way that resulted in things improving in some way. And that's the idea of early modern Europe, which hints at the development of modernity. That is to say, the modern world with material progress, with reason, with the scientific revolution that we all take for granted. It's in this period of early modern Europe that the scientific revolution really begins. And we see that in these distinct periods that many of you have probably heard of, known as the Renaissance, which is really the idea of a rebirth, the recapturing, rediscovery of knowledge from ancient Rome and Greece that sets the foundation for a launching into the modern era. The Age of Discovery, that involves Europeans reaching out to non-European places around the world. Columbus's voyages to the New World and subsequent European conquest and colonization of various places around the globe, and the transformation of colonies into the imperialist enterprise, whereby Europeans tried to dominate and control the peoples that they encountered, very often using the fruits of science and technology to do so, and also to justify their superiority to the people they encountered. We have the Reformation, the challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church, the Age of Reason, and the Enlightenment, which were absolutely critical in the development of new ways of thinking about the world that set the foundation for the scientific revolution that I want to talk about today. And then finally, full-blown modernity. And this is usually associated with two more or less simultaneous events that produce the modern ways of thinking that we take for granted today. And that is, on the one hand, political revolution, the French Revolution, which completely overturns all the old sources of authority, and on the other hand, the Industrial Revolution, which completely transforms the economy, which completely transforms the social and living landscapes that people inhabit. Combined with that is the Scientific Revolution, which also challenges previous forms of authority, and in particular, religious ways of explaining the world are replaced by rational and scientific ways of explaining the world. One point I want to make is that full-blown modernity, as I've described it, it doesn't happen all at once. It's not like the French Revolution. You can date it to 1789 and all of a sudden you have an overturning of the old order and the emergence of a new order. It's a much more gradual process that really involves the development of various ideas and attitudes and their connections to culture, politics, and economics over the course of many, many, many centuries, by and by producing the world that we take for granted, the modern world that we inhabit. Okay, so let me talk about one thing in particular. The reason that I call this talk the New Realism is because these transformations that I've been discussing, the foundation of it really goes back to that period of the Renaissance I talked about before and a new realism. And what I mean by that is that people began to understand the world not in symbolic or religious terms as they had before in the so-called Dark Ages, but in realistic terms, seeing the world the way it really was. And that was a very new kind of attitude associated with a kind of confidence that, you know what, we can figure out the world the way it actually is, we can see it the way it actually is, and having seen it the way it actually is, we can control, manipulate it, and change it into a different form. This idea of the New Realism is represented in a different way of doing art that emerges in the Renaissance, which, by the way, is connected with mathematics. And this is the notion of true perspective. One of the innovations in Renaissance art was to apply principles of mathematics to provide the illusion of true perspective, so that when you now had a painting, it looked like it was actually real. And so what Renaissance painters did is that they used mathematical principles and also principles of shading, chiaro, scuro, in Italian, to provide the illusion of light as it would be projected onto a surface and the shadows it would create, and also the illusion of depth. And you can see that very clearly in this example of a Renaissance painting. Here's another example of a sketch that illustrates the use of mathematical principles to provide the illusion of depth and of true perspective. And again, this is the New Realism, seeing the world in a fundamentally different way as it really is, and that inspires the confidence that you can actually control it and understand it. Absolutely essential for the scientific revolution and for the modern attitudes that we take for granted. Now here's an example of what it replaces. Medieval Dark Ages art, so to speak. This is an example of Russian medieval art, and there are a couple things that distinguish this from the New Realism of Renaissance art. First of all, there is no accurate or the illusion of true perspective. There is no sense of real depth or of proportion here in this particular painting. The other point is that the subject matter is metaphorical and religious. This is the Holy Trinity in this case. The figures aren't meant to represent something as they really look. They are meant to represent a world that exists beyond us, to get us to think about not the world we live in, but the world that we may inhabit if we go to church and if we are faithful, and so forth and so on. This is an example of Ivan the Terrible, again, pre-Renaissance art. Ivan the Terrible is represented here not the way he actually looked. In fact, it's safe to say he didn't look anything like this, but as an ideal kind of ruler, a prince. He was an archetype. All czars at that time were represented in this way, containing certain features, not as they really were. To represent the leader as he or she really was, that is a modern idea that emerges out of this New Realism. Here's another example of pre-Renaissance, pre-realistic art whose function is religious and metaphorical. Here we have the Mother of God in the Russian Orthodox tradition, the Virgin Mary in the Catholic tradition, holding the baby Jesus. As you can tell from this painting, this is not meant to be realistic. The point of it is metaphorical and symbolic. On the other hand, we have the figure of the young man by the Renaissance artist Botticelli. And in this painting, there are a couple differences if we think about this in comparison to the previous painting. First of all, the subject matter is secular. That is to say, it's not religious. And it has to do with representing the individual's character. why that individual, this particular person, was distinct as that person really was, or at least that was the attempt of the artist. Again, a very different kind of mission for the artist than what we saw before, and it aligns with the new mission of a person we will call a scientist in trying to figure out the way the world really is. Here we have another example of a very sophisticated realistic painting. It's almost photographic. That the ability to convey the sense of the way this woman really looked has been developed and refined to the point where it's as if we are looking at a photograph. And by the way, that the ability of the artist to do this made people consider those artists almost as if they were gods, because they had this ability, this godlike ability, to reproduce the world and to recreate it. Scientists also participate in this idea that they have this uncanny ability to dissect and understand the world and thus to control it and recreate it. Now, the figure, perhaps above all, that represents this confidence, this new confidence in the ability to understand the world and thus to control and manipulate it, is Leonardo da Vinci. And it's no accident that da Vinci was this sort of Renaissance man, meaning that he was both an artist and a scientist. He was an engineer, but also a very creative person. He combined all these things because at the outset of the scientific revolution, people didn't distinguish between the artist and the scientist. They were both looking at the world in a new way and using the powers of observation to recreate that world, either in their art or through their mechanical devices. And Leonardo da Vinci embodied all of that. He was very introspective, drawing portraits of himself. In other words, that he trained his powers of observation not only on the world around him, but also on himself, doing self-portraits, writing a diary. By the way, the writing of a diary is a kind of tool for examining the self, and it was applied by people just in the way that they would use their powers of observation to dissect a body, or perhaps to draw a plant in a more accurate way. Of course, here are some examples of Da Vinci's anatomical drawings, which many scientists today, many medical doctors find in some cases to be really amazingly accurate, even to this day. Of course, Da Vinci was also an engineer, so at the same time that he's examining himself, at the same time that he's examining the natural world around him, he's also thinking of devices that can control or rise above that natural world. He was an urban planner. He was planning new kinds of places where human beings would live. We call this urban planning in the modern world. Da Vinci also was therefore applying a kind of science, rational organization to how human beings would live in a particular space. Of course, he was also a great artist, representing at the same time religious themes with some of his new techniques, these new Renaissance techniques of painting. Military engineer. Da Vinci was willing to sell his services to the highest bidder, the state that would want to use his knowledge to enhance its own power. And here we see a connection between knowledge and power. In this case, the power of a state that wants to use this knowledge for military purposes. That's a major theme we'll see later on in this course. Now, I just wanted to give you a couple quotes from Da Vinci to illustrate this new attitude that is with us to this day, something that we perceive to be as very modern. So I'll read you the first quote. "It had long since come to my attention that people of accomplishment rarely sat back and let things happen to them. They went out and happened to things." It's a very different attitude from the Middle Ages, where people had little confidence that they could control their fate, that they could understand the world and thus control that world. As we switch into the Renaissance and up to the modern world that we live in, there's increasingly this confidence that because we can understand the world, we can also control it. And if we can understand the world, indeed we have the obligation to do something about making it better. And we'll see this as a kind of red thread that runs throughout not only Da Vinci's thinking, but also in the modern world that we live in. That knowledge about the world commands us to control and manipulate that world and make it different and hopefully better. Another quote, I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do. Again, emphasizes all the points I just made before. This connection between knowledge about the world and controlling that world, between theories about how the world works and action in this world. It's not enough to simply know the world. We're obligated to change it, to use that knowledge to manipulate and control it. Again, a very modern idea, and Da Vinci sort of marks that point at which this attitude begins to emerge in its fullest form and becomes predominant among many people in Europe. The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding. And this is something that I think is also a foundation of the scientific revolution, this kind of orgasmic moment that people experience when they understand something that was a mystery to them before. They have this kind of light bulb go off in their head, and they feel a kind of joy and pleasure from understanding the world. This is a foundation also of the scientific revolution. It's what motivates many scientists to be scientists. It's the act of discovery, which provides a kind of pleasure to people, and I don't think we can discount that role, that pleasure, as a factor in making people want to understand the world. Finally, he who loves practice without theory is like the sailor who boards ship without a rudder and compass and never knows where he may cast. Again, the obligation not simply to understand the world, but to use that knowledge to change the world, the connection between action and theory. And by the way, this is what connects us to this scientific enterprise. The application of knowledge to transforming the world ultimately impacts the human beings who live in it and thus connect them to the scientific revolution. Okay. Another example of this in what we would call the social sciences is Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli, not for nothing, is known as the first political scientist. He was the first one who believed that you could apply reason to understanding the world, not as it should be, but as it actually is. And if you can be realistic about how the world is, Machiavellian as we say, then you can understand that world and therefore control and manipulate it. Before Machiavelli, people wrote about ideal princes, not real ones. With Machiavelli, people begin thinking about real princes with all their warts, with all their cynicism, understanding the way the world really works. And if you do, then you can really begin to control your world.